She's not going to read anything of mine now.
Maybe it's a generational thing.
All right. So we are recording. We are ready to go. I hear, well, I listened to it too, but I heard from other people that you all did a very good job last week. So I'm going to do my best to stay out of the way.
We did.
I'm coughing all the time.
Todd was excellent.
He was.
So, we here, do the introductions.
I don't know what we're talking about.
Jesus.
Good evening, folks, and welcome to Crackers and Grape Juice version of Grace in Practice. We are joined this evening by Tier Hardy, so that, I mean, you know already it's going to be a better night.
Well, I knew, Todd, that you all would extend me grace for not being able to be here.
Absolutely.
Because if you couldn't extend me grace while we were reading this book, then what's the point?
Well, no hope for us, right?
Yeah. So there's still no hope.
And meanwhile, so Tony looks like he's about to be in an ISIS hostage video with that carpet behind him. Todd is dressed like Steve Bannon for some reason.
Yeah, it's cold in here.
So Josh Moneykaisen, get us started.
Here we go.
People are broken. Believe me, my heart should know. Some prayers are better left unspoken. I just wanna hold you and let the rest go. Oh, my friends are part saint and part sinner. We lean on each other, try to rise above. We're not afraid to admit we're all still beginners. We're all late bloomers when it comes to love. All my favorite people are broken. Believe me, my heart should know. Orphan believers, skeptical dreamers, step forward. You can stay right here, you don't have to go. Is each wound you receive just a burdensome gift? It gets so hard to live yourself above the ground. Poet says we must praise a mutilated world. We're all working the graveyard shift, might as well sing along. 'Cause all my favorite people are broken. Believe me, my heart should know. It's for your wide open. It ain't gonna be pretty, but you're not alone. 'Cause all my favorite people are broken. Believe me, my heart should know. Orphan believers, skeptical dreamers, you're welcome. You're safe right here. You don't have to go. 'Cause all my favorite people are broken. Believe me, I should know. Some prayers are better left unspoken. I just wanna hold you and let the rest go.
That was beautiful.
Yeah, what
Thank
was
you.
that, Josh?
It's a band called Over the Rhine. All my favorite people are broken.
Over the Rhine,
Oh.
like the Rhine Valley,
Like the Rhine River, yeah.
or like an orange rind?
Rhine like Germany. Rhine.
Deutschland über alles. Okay, so we're talking about grace in the church tonight, correct?
Correct.
So, Josh, Josh Redderer, I think you could you get us started? You recently wrote a piece for Mockingbird along these themes, and so if you could kind of summarize that for folks, and then we'll point it out to them in a future email.
Okay. Yeah, I was doing a review for a new book by Wendell Berry, and the characters in it just seemed, there's not very many people left like the people we talked about. And I also don't think it was romanticized. I remember some of those people, and they seem to be hard to find lately in the church. I'm just people with some integrity and kind of willing to pour into another generation. I just haven't seen that a lot, and was feeling a bit emo, and just kind of asked a couple of friends, is the church getting worse? I mean, are we, it's kind of the old Mitchell and Webb, with the Nazis, are we the baddies? You just, the moment of self-realization that this may not be our shining moment. And I reached out to, thanks to Jason, Will Williman, who has a great way. I thought I wanted to pair him with Wendell Berry because he's kind of, the Methodist version, bishop version of Wendell Berry, and the same accent anyway. And he gave a wonderful kind of, just read a little bit at the end of it, but he gave this wonderful summation of kind of where our hope is in the church. And I think it's actually a good way to start it, because I do think we tend to be a bit pessimistic if we look too hard at the church. I think that's true of any time in history, but right now it doesn't seem like a great time. But he said, he talks about the United Methodists in particular, but he said, he laments at the state of the United Methodist Church at the moment. But he says, yet by the grace of God, I'm reminded that we are no better nor worse than the ragtag saints who came before us, no less recipients of God's mercy, all dependent upon a God who loves sinners, including his poor, battered, compromised bride, the church. And I think that's kind of a good way to start out the section on grace in the church, because that's the baseline we like to be.
Yeah, I think what I find interesting at that description, I read that article, and we do have this sort of narcissistic tendency to want to think that, we're either way better than we were, or we're way worse. I mean, we do run those, we run to both those ends of the spectrum, and I found it interesting the way that Zahl in this chapter actually used his own experience in the Episcopal Church. I thought that was really good, because he gave some sort of concrete illustrations, and so when mashing these two up, your piece and this chapter up, it seems really pertinent that we ought to be looking for those sorts of illustrations ourselves, so that in communication, whether it's in preaching or just conversations about the church, that we can, maybe bring a little equilibrium to the reality that, I forget what Jason always likes, or not always, but quotes that Luther line, the church may be a whore, but she's my mother, or something like that, So, I mean, we can bring some equilibrium that gives us some balance to our own participation, realistic participation in the condition of the church. I don't know. What do you think, Tier?
In thinking of the church, I went back and looked at the papers that I had to write theology papers for ordination. I submitted them around this time about a year ago, and I was like, oh, let me go back and look and see what I wrote. And what I wrote was, as you would expect, amazing. And then I went back and looked at the feedback I received from the theology team on our Board of Ordained Ministry, and they wrote that Tier wrote something to the effect of very thoughtfully using Wesleyan theology. However, his points about the nature of the church would have been strengthened had he mentioned Jesus. And so I reading that, and then reading this chapter in the book, it just made me think that I think all of us in the church going back to the early church, would probably have a better ecclesiology, a better understanding of the nature of the church, if we would keep Jesus in his rightful place at the head, and not ourselves. And so to Todd, doing a little bit of self-reflection, now I'm left wondering where in the last 6 years of pastoral ministry I've forgotten about Jesus, which is a little bit it saddens me a little bit. It's a little humbling, but it also a little bit of hope as well, because Jesus is still the head of the church, whether or not we remember that he is.
So Josh, Moneykaisen, and Tony, I want to give the floor to you. But Tier mentioned John Wesley, right? And it seems to me that John Wesley is a good example of what happens in the church, that Wesley is someone whose heart is strangely warmed hearing Luther's preface to Paul's letter to the Romans. And it changes his life. And then Methodism, I mean, it's in the name, becomes a process by which you get your act together. And so, you're both pastors, you're both older than me, by quite a lot. And so, it really does seem like it's like grace can be really hard to keep center in the life of a church, because there's this assumption among Christians that, okay, well, we got that, so now we got to go do the other things. And so talk about just the difficulty of keeping the main thing in the life of a church.
Well, I guess I wondered, after reading this chapter, if there was grace for those of us who had some ecclesiology. I felt kind of
Okay, so for folks who haven't read it yet, what does the word ecclesiology mean?
Oh, it's your doctrine of the church. It's what you think the church is and is for. And you know, I get somebody's building something next door. I don't know if you can hear it.
No, we
But-
can't.
Oh, good. I can.
It could be your ISIS captors getting ready to come and get you.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. But I felt like I was wrong for kind of having some amount of love for the church and belief in the church. That if I was really grace filled, I would sort of think the church was a dumb idea or something. So I was, it was just odd from the apostle of grace here, Paul Zahl, to feel so judged.
It may have been a particular point in time, though. He was experienced the ecclesiology of his church. That was a particularly rough time for the Episcopal Church, and he was in the middle of it.
Well, my
So-
church is a mess. I mean, it's not like I'm, you know, I mean, if you've been at this as long as I have and as old as I am compared to Jason, who's really just so young.
Baby.
he
Just a
should hardly
teeny
be-
bopper.
He should hardly be
Tiny.
speaking, you know, but I mean, I don't have illusions, I don't think, about the church, but I guess I had some hopes for it.
And I think he does. Now, I do think this was, you know, a few years back. I think he's probably softened a little bit, or I don't know. He may have went the other way. I'm not sure. It might depend on
Well,
the day.
I
but-
did take his point in the sense that, well, I guess I heard 2 points. One was that we tend to have the idea that the church is sort of a original sin-free zone or a depravity-free zone. And nobody who's a pastor who has half a brain believes that. I mean, we get a close-up on people's depravity, including our own, pretty regularly. And then I guess the other,
I know, I'm going out of the.
I'm sorry, I got interrupted. I lost my train of thought there. Go ahead, your turn, Josh.
All grace, all grace.
Yeah, I think so. He points out two warnings,
I'll be back.
being that
I wanted to tell you that.
sometimes we can make
Like, seems like that's more
I think
important.
one tack is where
Why, it's
you
just
you have
really
too
honest.
high expectations of what the church is and what it'll accomplish, and the first time you taste failure, then you just say, what's the point? You walk away and become an atheist. And then the other tack is that church becomes this zero-sum game where it's winner take all, and we no longer have any space for people who think different than us, who hold different opinions, because they're just wrong, and we're too busy on this project about being right. And as Josh alluded to, you know, he's writing this not long after the denominational schism of the Episcopal Church. And the concern in our own church was not just that a majority would come out on one side or another on the issue of human sexuality. It would be that, okay, now that we've won, there's no place for progressives. There's no place for traditionalists, right? We won. That means you either have to get on board or you have to leave.
Mhm.
And that just seems to forget Jesus and forget our roots from where we come from, because we've been acting like that for a terribly long time.
It's also very much the model of contemporary American politics, where the other side has to be destroyed.
there was an interview. I was just thinking about him the other day, Father Thomas McKenzie, who Jason interviewed, and there was a moment, and he fell out kind of in the denominational split, and he was part of kind of the early the early days of the split of the Episcopal Church, but he commented something that really was from personal experience. The idea of when the conservatives left, he was part of the more conservative group. When they left, the larger church lost something. And he said, it's the same. And he said, from our side, from the conservative side, we lost something when we lost the progressive side of the church. We were all meant to be together in that. We were under a tent. Some people kind of fall along the edges of it, but he said we were under the same tent. There was a loss to both sides in that. And I thought that was a hard one. I paid attention to what he said because that was a hard one comment that he learned from deep experience. And I kind of, I mourn his loss. He passed away about a year ago, and I certainly mourn his loss because he had an enormous amount of wisdom for someone his age.
Tony, I was wondering, because I know you mentioned that you didn't you felt attacked. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth now about the Paul's, saying that he has no ecclesiology. But then he writes, to have no ecclesiology is to have an ecclesiology. If he had said that he had a low ecclesiology, would that be okay with you?
Oh, probably. And I don't feel like I was attacked. I just felt like, I wouldn't have been in the vocation I'm in if I didn't love the church to some extent. I love it. It's a lover's quarrel, but I don't feel like, well, I don't want to stress the point too much. It just, I thought it was a little bit odd to come away from somebody who's so insistent on grace feeling kind of judged.
Yeah. So I'm gonna before I start coughing again, what he says in this chapter about Mr. Magoo and 3 months, that I think it's a mistake to what he ascribes to the role of a pastor. Like that needs to be the role of leaders, lay leaders in a congregation, to go through life with an open hand, to see all kinds of things and pretend like you don't see it. That pastors have a particular vocation, but all baptized believers have like a share in that same vocation. And so I think I think what he says there, I want to make that applicable to members of a congregation, because I'm just thinking, I think Katie's here. Maybe she's paying attention. So like my friend Katie, someone, that like, oh my gosh, there's other people that I know for like, so there's all kinds of like, you can say you don't have an ecclesiology, you have a low view of the church, but the reality is like all the other Christians have one, and they're doing like profound damage to people. Like lots of people grow up in like, Christian contexts that just beat people down, make them feel like they're not enough, shame them, do psychological damage to them, give them fucked up theology. And so like, I want to say to Paul Zahl, like, well, no, like you need to have a high enough view of the church that like your people take it seriously, that they're getting the message right. And they're like embodying it as imperfectly as they can try to do. And so like, so like one example that I've been thinking about the last month or so, and maybe I've talked about this, but we did a double funeral for a couple at my church. A few people here I know will know this couple. So Burnett and Ramona Thompson were both very old, but in planning the funeral service for them, their daughter Barbara shared with me how long after, so they had taught a Sunday school class for eons, but long so Ramona's expiration date on when she should have been teaching a Sunday school class had long since passed. Like dementia had set in. But her daughter described how everyone in the class, allowed her to continue serving in that role Sunday after Sunday, just as as a gesture of grace. And with like so many bad examples of churches on the internet and in the news and on like, oh my God, like every day on Twitter, I think you need to have a high enough view to not just reduce Christianity to like an individual experience or journey or whatever, and like lift up like these like good examples of like, no, like ordinary people get it and they're doing it, even if they can't put words to it.
It's the equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. I mean, that I always we call ministers, but really it's the lay people who are ministers. I mean, they're doing the ministering, and instead we kind of foist that off on the clergy, and it's not what the Bible says. Seems like they're a slightly different job, but we don't read the Bible, and I don't know, we call it whatever. So, what you go to seminary for?
I always like the example of some people will know Nadia Bolz-Weber, the Lutheran priest, and in the tenure of her, she had a church plant, and they had this occasion where she was rehabbing a downtown cathedral, and all the misfits and left behinds, the orphans, were coming to her church. And as news of this spread, then people who she jokingly calls, the ones wearing Dockers, khaki pants, and loafers, heard about this, and they wanted to commute in from the suburbs to see what was going on because there was some move of the Spirit. Well, she told new people when they got there, she said, look, we're not perfect. Churches are made of human beings. Someday we will disappoint you or hurt you. Someday I will disappoint you or hurt you. It's a matter of when, not if. This church will let you down. And then she says, please decide right now, right up front, that you'll stick around when that happens and let God's grace do its work in the cracks left by the brokenness of human communities. She set them up with the expectation that, like, you've heard news of this and you come here full of expectations and you just want to see it rise and be glorious. And somebody's going to screw with your conception of that. Someone's going to challenge that. Someone's going to have a contrasting vision, and it's going to hurt you. But purpose that God shows up in those spaces, and that's where grace works in weakness. And we've talked about this before, but that whole contrast between a theology of glory that's like we're kicking ass and taking names, we're just getting better and better on the way to victory, or a theology of the cross that says Jesus is met on the other side of defeat, right? My perception is opened, my heart is widened. The example, Jason, you gave of the people in Sunday school class, it's like we're going to create space to allow this to happen because we value this person who's created in God's image. That's not possible when you're just thinking about success. But if you're thinking about grace and love, then that's a beautiful picture.
Yeah. And so Cheer and I, we spoke with Elaine and Janine Heath today. You guys probably know who Elaine Heath is. But they've both so together they've written a memoir of growing up in a profoundly abusive home, and also outside of their home experiencing like sexual abuse. And they've written it in an incredibly plain and raw way. And in talking with them about that and just some of their experiences, bad experiences in churches, it's I don't know that we do enough as pastors or just members of congregations in thinking about how the language we use, the stories we don't tell, convey a certain, like, it's a message of law, right? That, you know, and it, in effect, it belies the message of grace. You know, it says, like, well, the way you talk Monday through Saturday, you can't talk that way here. The story you might tell your therapist, you're not actually free to share that during, like, joys and concerns. You know, that, you know, like what your pastor said in the pulpit, that's not okay. And so it's, you know, it's one thing to say, I believe in X, but you got to go all the way, right? Or it doesn't, like, you got to put flesh on it, or people don't believe it.
I wanted to kind of emphasize my ornery point with regard to his section on church administration. I mean, I'm so tired of pastors saying, I hate administration, or, you know, it's beneath me. I regard it decent administration as contributing to building up a community where people can trust. And when the administrative stuff is fucked up, people distrust each other. They distrust the church, and they feel unsafe. So I just think the kind of the downgrade of administration that is so fashionable among clergy is bullshit.
Yeah, I think
it's lazy is what it is. It is clergy being lazy. Sorry, clergy. Like,
well,
it's what you signed up for, or it's what Jesus signed you up for. If I'm going to keep forgetting to put him in here, it's what you're supposed to be doing.
I mean,
well, you got to have some theology underneath of it. I mean,
Yeah.
It's not like just, I'm not, it's not like I just love reading, you know, budget reports or something like that, or that I want to just spend all my time writing a personnel manual. But you can really get a church screwed up, or a church really gets itself screwed up when it doesn't have any clarity about who's on first in terms of personnel issues. And
Yeah.
you can hurt people badly. And so I have little tolerance for that.
Yeah, but I think that's the right frame, right, Tony? That there are pastors that I can name, Dear can probably name them too, who kind of lack eschatological conviction, and so they retreat into being, like, you know, an executive pastor or the leader of an organization.
Totally, I got that.
So there are pastors like that, and then there are churches who you know, lose the plot, and, like, all they're thinking about is, like, paying the bills, funding the building, you know, like staffing programs, like all that stuff. So, like, that's definitely true. But you're right that to think about how you organize and lead a congregation, it has to be consistent with your message. And so, like, you know, you've got to be transparent. Because as soon as, like, people think there's, like, a subtext to everything, well, like, you know, that contradicts the message that, like, well, because of God's grace, like, everything can be brought out into the open. And so, like, and you have to, like, value, like, your staff people, because, like, God values them. And you have to, like, be, like, a non-anxious leader, because, like, you know, Jesus isn't dead. So it's like, this isn't all on us.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, I completely agree with you. Like, you got to do it in a way that corroborates the message.
You know, this takes me back to, so, you know, when you were describing the interview you did, you and Tyr did, Jason, and the whole notion of creating space for, you know, transparency or honesty, place to talk about the very ways in which people are harmed. And there was a line, like, right out of the gate that I caught, and maybe to call back to something Josh said, that this was written, or seems to have been written, at a time when Paul was having his own ecclesiological crisis, because he says, where is it?
Or is that
In
section where he talks
in
about
225, he really just says, no one is ever awakened in the middle of the night anxious about ecclesiology per se. You may wake up worried about your child or upset about something someone said to you during the day, but you never wake up worried about your concept of church. I mean, beneath that is really a statement that says, what I'm writing from here forward is my own existential experience. And so I'm going to mete out my experience to you because I never woke up concerned about my concept of church. I'm going to say that in the midst of the last 20 or 30 years, because of the variety of ways the church has been talked about, deconstructed, reconstructed, that there are probably a lot of young people who have spent some time, waking up thinking about their concept of church. I remember I remember being in San Diego and listening to a string of presenters telling everyone present, most of them way younger than me, that everything that they knew about church was dead. And so immediately, if you're sitting there and you're thinking like, now, wait a minute, God called me to this thing, and now everybody's, these stage presences are telling me that, all this stuff is dead. You're going to go home from that conference and you're going to be waking up in the middle of the night going like, okay, so what have I got wrong? What have I screwed up about? So I just, in thinking back through this, I found a lot of things that Paul said just really striking. I felt them. I felt kind of his own internal wrestling with those things, and I appreciate that. But I do think that in large measure, some of the things that we are grappling with that he said about administration or other things are certainly an outgrowth of his own experience. And that maybe Paul deserves a little bit of our grace because we don't know the whole story behind the chapter. And maybe it would be good if he offered a little footnote to say, now that I'm older and you guys are younger, and it's okay for me to talk about the things that happened that prompted the content of this chapter, I am going to do a podcast telling you what was behind my chapter in Grace and Practice from 2000, whenever it was.
Okay. Well, my question then is,
it's called PZ's podcast.
Yeah, right.
I was going to say,
right.
so Josh Rederer is probably the Paul Zahl expert among us.
Oh, good. No.
Could you speak on his behalf to how he might change this chapter, what he might footnote or what he might add?
No, because that,
You're not
that
playing
would just,
along.
No, it just evolved. It's just, it has evolved through his experiences. And he goes, he gets a lot of shit for it, but he goes to a lot of different kinds of churches, let me tell you. And he has but I've also heard him explain why he does it. And you know what? He's not wrong. He's explained why he does. He explained in detail. He's done it in conferences, explained why he goes to certain churches. And, it may make some of us cringe, but I also think he embraces a much broader ecclesiology than a lot in his own denomination and peer group. But part of it was, and he's been quite honest, some of it was his own prejudices against other types of people, and he would have given them dirty looks and run away. If he's talked about meeting early evangelicals, and he just didn't want anything to do with them. And most of the time I'd agree with him. But I do think that is an evolving, moving thing. The reason I say that, and I recommend people listen to it because I enjoy it, and there's great music. But if you listen over the decade or two he's done PZ's podcast, he's kind of went in deep in some areas of ecclesiology, down to hats. Crying out loud, he goes into vestments, but he's also, you can see how he's evolved. And really the podcasts are just him thinking out loud about these things. And he gets feedback. People email him. He'll talk about the emails, So I've kind of appreciated that, whether you agree with him or not, just watching the evolution and progression of a theologian in relationship to the church. He's also an experienced pastor. He's a theologian and a pastor. He draws and with serious concentration in the areas of counseling. He probably, I don't think he's degreed in counseling, but he very easily could be. He has a great insight. So I've been fascinated, just even in the few years that I've listened to him, to watch how he's changed his views on church and ecclesiology. So yeah, I just it's a moving target is why I'm being a little evasive about it, because it could change tomorrow.
But I will I just want to say, for someone who wasn't going to offer the footnote, that was quite the footnote.
That's right.
As an outside observer, I would say that even though we're getting on this tear about ecclesiology, I mean, it is the chapter, but even though that may be a moving target, I think the thing that's consistent with Paul is that he's constantly looking through the sights of low anthropology.
Yes, absolutely.
Original sin, total depravity. Don't expect a lot from people. You're not going to change people with the law. You need grace in everyday life. So those are things that are consistent. How that plays out may tinker with context to context.
Absolutely.
But those are the important things.
He's there was I just happened to pull out his book, Who Will Deliver Us, and it was from 83. And I guess I'd never looked at the blurbs in the back. And one of them said, Zahl knows the authentic gospel and the 20th century human heart and probes deeply into both. J.I. Packer. So I thought that was just kind of a thing. But I do think that focus was noticed early on by, he was friends with Stott and some others who were kind of looking in the same area. I view kind of both of them as positive influences on Calvinism. There are negative influences on Calvinism, and I think Stott and Packer were some of the more positive ones. But I do think he, as I've kind of watched his kind of tying into what you're saying, if I look at the people that's kind of been associated with his name, it has been people who, whether it's Steve Brown or some of the others, there are people even within their particular groups and denomination who have a particular grace-centered focus to their ministry. And so I've kind of noticed that it may be wildly different denominations and can veer from progressive to conservative, but they all kind of have the same focus.
So two thoughts, and not to get too insider baseball, but in terms of ecclesiology, Tony, just to be fair, I think it's probably you can't talk about how you have a low ecclesiology while you're also the dean of the Cathedral of the Advent.
The title.
I mean, honestly, nobody does, ecclesiology better than like the Anglican tradition.
Comes with a slightly smaller miter.
But they also, in my view, do some of the excesses. I mean, they got their own funny language, and they've got, it was his description of the Brook Brothers and Talbots and all that. I mean, it's a very class conscious operation.
Yeah, everything that Jane Austen character. Yeah.
And people love their vestments way too much, in my view, and the whole smells and bells. I go screaming out of those churches.
Spoken like a true Calvinist. But to make it more, just thinking about like non-clergy people, a lot of, church is important to Christians.
Yeah.
This is their community. This is what they give money to. These are the people that will bury them, take care of their kids. you know, like I wouldn't be here right now if there weren't lay people in a congregation that like mentored me when I was an asshole. And so it is important. And I think,
When
Well, and it's like Todd says too, there's been kind of a trend, and I probably have lent my voice to it occasionally to, pronounce death upon the church as, as if it were a cool thing.
yeah, so I was
and-
just going to say though that
Yeah.
like, so, so Stan the Man, Stanley Hauerwas has a very high ecclesiology, a very high view of the church, a very, he has high expectations that baptism makes Christians a very particular people amongst other people. And I'm on board with that. The problem is there's too many Christian groups out there who think what makes them distinct is behavior modification, either on the left or the right. Like we don't dance or we use the right pronouns, and really, so like if you, like from the New Testament, like we've been baptized to like proclaim a particular message, and that's what Paul Zahl is writing about. And so there's not enough people who have a high ecclesiology for the sake of proclaiming the gospel of grace.
Yeah.
And embodying it as imperfectly as we can.
I appreciate and agree with that. I think one of the other, I guess I'm in a contrarian mode tonight, but one of the things that was true for me in kind of our last stages of American Christendom is that people would go to a church, maybe not because it was just the church they chose that fit their lifestyle or predilections or values or politics. One of the things that irritates me now is that people, we're so choice driven that I hear continually from people about how their church is so special and their church is so different and their church is so unlike other churches. And I think we get into a kind of idolatry of our church as a kind of special club is a consequence of moving away from, I guess one thing I'd say about Christendom was kind of in its worst forms, it was if you lived in a certain area, you belonged to that church kind of by legislative fiat. But there was a time when the church, in my experience, was actually more diverse than in our time when we're talking about diversity all the time. Okay, I've grumped about things enough. I'll stop.
No, I mean, that makes sense though. Like if Christ is the head of the church, if we keep Christ in the church, like, sorry to keep going back to what I was talking about earlier, then there really is nothing special that separates my congregation from Jason's congregation from Tony's congregation. The stuff that separates us is all of the stuff that Hauerwas calls bullshit that doesn't matter anyways.
Yeah. Well, we're as Spufford said, we're the International League of the Guilty. And we don't escape it by finding this is the church that is so different than all those other churches I've experienced.
Well, or we're making bullshit the feature. I mean,
the bullshit's more fun, or it's easier.
But that's the selling point. I mean, that thing that he's talking about is bullshit. That becomes the selling point for not consumer driven, just anybody wanting to get people into their church. I mean, and also sometimes I think we just tend to clump into those churches. I know a particular denomination that the church locally has its apportionments and fines already collected and saved up and ready for the split. And it is purely based on politics. That's all. Because I know the people who go to the church, and I can tell you how they vote, because they're very free in telling. But to me, that I agree exactly with what Tony said. That feels a little bit like a distant memory, and it's not that long ago. But it just the degree of polarization. Now, I don't think it's hopeless. I think people are going to realize it's not, as we're starting to do, and preachers are starting to preach on, realizing that, hey, this isn't a good thing. And hopefully praying that the Holy Spirit moves in his people and turns on some light bulbs. I mean, that's the only thing that the quality of the arguments is going to have a little bit of impact, but I'm kind of betting on the Holy Spirit to do the rest of the work. And there's a bit of an awakening and turning away from that type of polarization. It will bear its own fruit. It won't be good, and I think it'll be. Eventually, people will realize it's not a good thing.
So, Josh,
Eventually.
what would Mr. Magoo have to say about polarization?
He didn't see it. I know that this may still be some insider kind, but I did like his phrase, an ecclesiology of suspicion. The reason I liked that is it ought to provide leaders, lay leaders, pastors with the means to level expectations, because it's expectations that has caused the exodus, and we have elevated like what Josh, what you're talking about, we've elevated like what we can do for you to the point that the expectations are built in when we sign on, and we ignore the realities that you're actually signing up to be with a bunch of people just like you, who, like what Jason and Tier did in this interview, evidently, realize are going to give us some people who are going to tell us, yeah, well, you probably should tell people the minute they walk in the door, we suck. And so if you think anything like better's coming along, you probably just ought to get used to the fact that we all do, because that's going to, it is a realistic anthropology, but I do think that this ecclesiology of suspicion phrase is I just liked it. I thought it resonated, and maybe it's my age. I'm not as young as Jason is, but it could be. But I think that's a pretty descriptive position or posture to take.
I think Nadia Bolz-Weber, as Josh was talking about, I think she is. Thank you. I was going to remind you. I think she's someone she's really made a feature of that in her ministry, and I think has done a great job of preparing expectations. And even in her ecclesiology, I remember her once saying what she thought of bishops, and she said bishops were created for people like me. And it was just because she's a little bit of a kind of a maverick type of person, but she appreciated the structure, the protection, not only for her flock but for herself, that an ecclesiology provided. And
back to that administrative piece.
Exactly. And I've appreciated, she has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, but I have appreciated her voice over the years, mainly because of her ability to communicate it without any type of churchy language. And everybody understands exactly what she's saying. And I've appreciated that over the years. It has its limits, but it has, I don't know how, from whether it was John Zahl to anybody, everybody quotes her because it's difficult to say it better than she said it. Mm-hmm. And her books have been helpful. I've passed her books around. They've helped kind of break open some very uptight people, because it's kind of hard to argue that she doesn't understand the gospel. And so I've used her to confront people with that. I can't like someone like her. And then they read the book and they're like, oh. And that does a lot of work. I don't have to say anything else after that. So I've appreciated her ministry, but in particular, her kind of view of ecclesiology and her pastoral sense of dealing with those things.
Jason, were you getting ready to talk about preaching?
I wasn't. What do you want me to say?
Were
He
you the one
wants
that
your
put the
sermons,
picture up?
Paul wants your sermons to be shorter.
Was that you or Tier that put the picture of Luther with
Oh
Christ in the
no,
middle?
sorry. I'm sorry. I was trying to see if there was any questions, and I hit the share screen thing. And so,
Yeah.
Got lucky. That's all you shared with us.
Well, I'd go back to the imputation discussion that he had, I think, in
What
the
do you want
first
me
or
to
second chapter, and kind of alluded to in the Mr. Magoo part,
Mhm,
where
mhm.
we're imputing to people a righteousness that they don't have as the work of Christ in them. And I feel that's not just limited to individuals, but I feel
Mhm.
that is appropriate to the church, that we are imputing the possibility of God doing something with this league of the guilty that by grace that is important to in a sense see us by
Test 1, 2,
grace
3.
as better than we are.
There's something that he says, Paul Zahl says, and who will deliver us. It was funny because I just opened to, you were talking about imputation. And he says, a third word needs definition. This is imputation. To impute means to ascribe a characteristic to someone that he does not have by nature. For example, I can, for any number of reasons, impute integrity to someone I normally think of as corrupt, or deviousness to someone I normally think of as decent. In doing so, I may actually affect the person's behavior. A person can become as he is regarded. So it's a little bit of the, My Fair Lady type of thing, I guess. But, there is a powerful message of imputation, just even in that sense. I've heard that kind of divorce from Christianity, even though it, had the wider culture likes to adopt that, kind of abstract it from God, but they got it from us. So we're going to keep claiming it.
And that's a good, I think that's because we don't use the word imputation that much in the life of the church, I don't think. But, we talk about how God declares us righteous, even though we're not, perhaps. But to understand that what grace in practice looks like is to treat the people that you share a congregation with, the people who come into your life, the people who come through your doors, to the difficult people, in any church, to attribute to them a good and good motives and a faithfulness that maybe isn't there and is definitely hard to see. But that's what it looks like.
Scott Jones always used to talk about, we use impute to ascribe bad motives. We're imputing bad motives to someone in our usage now of that term, rather than positive. But he's like, impute away, if God wants to impute his righteousness to me, please bring it on. But it's funny how that shifted over time. Impute means, it's not positive.
And so, that's what it means to be a people of grace, right? It's not just that, like, we're the people who believe in God's grace in Jesus Christ. It's that we're the people who are, we're willing to take the risk of imputing good to people that isn't there. And
it's the doctrine he mentions, and which is very big with Nadia Bolz-Weber, of the simul justus et peccator. It's that we're both, and it's so easy. I think I said before, in my consulting days, I just worried about the number of clergy who were really kind of down on their congregations. We're kind of just spent all their time complaining about these terrible people. There's something wrong with that.
Yeah, it is a point he made in this chapter that there's plenty of condemnation going on out there.
Yeah.
Plenty.
Yeah. And if it's not going on out there, it's going in here.
Sure. Yeah.
the voices we say to ourselves, we impute to ourselves, nobody could love you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so to before we wrap up tonight, Mrs. Grigg is camera ready. So she's joining us as a panelist with her questions.
Miley.
I guess I'm camera ready.
You emailed me and told me you were camera ready.
I know. I yes. Okay. All right.
Your audio's working.
There we go. Are you in Josh's house right now?
Looks like he's in Josh Redder's house.
Yeah, that's right.
Josh, I didn't know
I
you guys had a
really enjoy your
relationship. But
singing, Joshua.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, well, should I ask some questions? I mean, I think you answered some of them, maybe. You can tell me if you did. But I've really enjoyed the book, and you guys are like rock stars. So anyway.
Who's imputing now?
Let's stop now.
Yeah, that's right.
Good practice.
Good practice. Let's see. I don't know. Maybe this is if there is no ecclesiology, would there be so many denominations? And why would we choose a denomination or gear towards a certain denomination or church if there should not be any ecclesiology, if that ruins the church? I don't know. According to some.
Good question.
so answer it, Tony.
Well, I think denominations are, we tend to kind of justify them on doctrinal grounds, but they're really cultural constructs,
Mhm.
and they're communities of people who have some cultural stuff in common. Maybe they part of an ethnic group that came at a certain time, and and have. So I think denominations, but we try to make it all about some point of doctrine that we've got figured out that other people don't. But I think they're mostly just kind of like historical accidents. And probably the strongest denominations tend to be immigrant congregations that share a cultural thing and rituals and that kind of thing, and that tends to erode over time. So that's one thought I have about it. So I don't buy much into the idea that there's one denomination that's got it figured out. I think that's BS, but I don't feel like I need to condemn denominations. I don't mind people hanging out together because they had a certain kind of experience as people from Scotland or something like that.
Yeah, I think of the Korean
y'all can do
Methodists.
better than that. What?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the Korean Methodists. I mean, I
Yeah.
lived in Hawaii for a while, and there was a lot of Koreans, and they were all Methodists, and so that was definitely a cultural thing. But I also think I'm kind of one of those. I grew up in a non-denominational setting, but I've kind of over time grown to appreciate denominations. I don't mind some of the distinctions because I think in part they kind of oddly preserve bits of theology and doctrine that kind of gets washed away. And sometimes they have a weird emphasis on it that just kind of ruins everything. But a lot of times I do think that I'm kind of happy that there's a little bit of concentration on some of the odd parts of it, because it does preserve something, and because everything gets kind of flattened over time, and we're all Unitarians by the time it's over, and it's like, why be a Christian at a certain point? we're distinct, we're a peculiar people, and really we're trying to make ourselves not peculiar, and I think that's the wrong direction. I think everything we're talking about, grace makes us peculiar. There's nothing about us that naturally inclines towards grace. It's part of the low anthropology, or at least a very limited way. So weirdly, I do think at their best, denominations preserve bits of the gospel that, put them all together and we got.
Yeah, I hear you talking, Josh, and I tend to think of that the picture in the book of Revelation where it says, the nations are streaming into the temple and they're all bringing the particular parts of glory that they have. They're all incomplete, but you could look at this group, and this is a time when nation means people group. It doesn't mean a country with borders, right? So a nation could be a denomination, but it says, God's grace shined in this people group in this particular way. And as we bring all of these things together, right, there's this, the phrase might be trite, but there's this unity in diversity. You don't lose your distinctiveness, but you don't cut yourself off from the body. We're one, but we're many.
I've got a little icon. I don't have it right near me, but of the it was when ISIS killed some of the Coptic Christians, and it's something that I've really thought about, because their particular branch of Christianity would seem extraordinarily foreign to us, much of it. But when I look at that icon, all I see is, fellow brothers in Christ that were murdered. So, there's no distinction there. So I think that, just kind of what they've brought, and, but it's kind of been something that, particularly there, when I was growing up, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, it was particularly vicious, but, it was a lot of, they were kind of saved or mostly saved or just by the skin of their teeth saved. And I always thought, there's part of me that, my limited knowledge, what's the difference? I mean, if you're saved, that's the good part, right? So at least they are. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just look at the group here, and everybody here represents a rather wide group of denominations, and most of them mainline, but I'm non-denominational at this point. I might have some affinities towards some, but I grew up United Methodist, so, I'm sorry.
Everybody grew up United Methodist.
Yes, I honestly think that I think that's true. Literally everybody did.
Like, we just
I
don't
do think
retain
that's
anybody.
true.
Good Lord.
I did not.
I did not.
So other questions, ma'am?
Yeah, that was good. You talked about the responsibility that laity has, that equal responsibility. Is there a point where, or should laity leaders in the local church, of course, maintain that Christ-focused mindset, but is there a point where or how can they get to a point, or should they get to a point where they will effectively balance leading with the law and grace? And is there a balance of leading with, and when I say law, I'm talking more about, I guess, a sort of a law of justice, or when it comes to really having to deal with going or dipping into the law to lead. Is there a balance? Should there be? Or how does grace trump law when law may seem necessary? I don't know. I went all over, but
No, it's a good question. Josh Moneykaisen.
I was just talking. Where's Todd and Tier?
I know we have the book of discipline, you know.
Oh,
So how do okay?
it's a
So
good
Well, I think-
doorstop.
I think,
Sorry.
I'll go again. I think there's a place in the church for what he calls the first use of the law,
Mhm.
which is kind of what I was talking about in the value of sound or honest or transparent administration. Is you don't want to, I mean, we need to have some rules, to have some order, to keep people that are really disturbed, I guess, or manipulative or something from, you know, trespassing or abusing others. So I think there is a place for, you know, kind of this is how this is good process, or this is whatever we want to call it. But it's finally held in the context of grace, and we don't, you know, just following the rules is necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah, how we like, you know, how churches take measures to like protect children and youth. That's not like another.
Yeah, I was just gonna
Yeah.
say, I don't know
Example,
that
yeah.
I could recreate his turn of phrase, but I heard him addressing a group of Paul Zahl. I heard him addressing a group of clergy, and the question of kids came up. The hypothetical situation was, imagine for some reason your local church is going on a mission or something like that, but what happens is the group of 30 people that are with you are going to be in tents, and this one couple who are members of your church are there, and they've brought with them their 18-year-old daughter and her 17-year-old boyfriend, and they want to stay in a tent together by themselves. And Paul Zahl was talking about from the perspective of, you know, subconsciously it's a first use of the law, but he also, like I said, I can't exactly recall his turn of phrase, but he was saying something more along the lines of, we're going to present this as an allusion to excellence. Like, because we're Christian, we're always trying to move this way. You know, we're trying to do these things. We just don't do that. But we never move to the point of diminishing the persons. You know, you can't do that, you know, or if you want to do that, then just get out of here. You know, you can't be on our church function because you're living in sin. So he was really conscious of being gracious, but it didn't mean being without boundaries.
Good.
I'm sorry. I was struck by page 239, and it talked about the grace in the pulpit as interpretation. It was in the interpretation section where he states that grace will elicit things inside you that you did not know you had, and law will suppress what little you think you had and shrink you down. So it made me think of how, you know, the gospel, and how Jason has, you know, is so great at brilliantly teaching the gospel.
Yeah. We all love Jason.
Well, I belong to his church, so anyway, it made me think about how when the message is delivered through grace, he talked about how the gospel should convict us, right? Or the gospel should convict us. So when the message is delivered through grace, this conviction will elicit that acceptance of that conviction. And when the message is delivered through law, it will suppress and reject that conviction and cause us to maybe, you know, move apart. So my question is that connection with that, is that a fair connection? Did that make sense? I was kind of
Yeah, no, what it made me think, so Todd and I were both at the Mockingbird conference in Texas a couple of weeks ago, and there's an English professor named Lee Hickman. Is that right, Todd?
That's right.
And so she's an aficionado of like horror and science fiction and things like that. And so ostensibly her presentation was about Stranger Things and how it's a gospel story. But she began right off the bat sharing things about herself, such as her porn addiction and her blackout drinking and her resentment of her twin sister who got married and left her alone. Just raw things that you know, and so I think, you know, in the light, like that's like if you really believe in this message of grace, like you got to take the risk. So Josh mentioned Nadia Bowles-Weber. Like one of the things she says is like it's her job as the preacher to go first, you know, like share the thing that people don't want to share and show that it's okay to share it in the light of God's grace. And so it's you know, so I think it's the job of all Christians and church people to make sure we're not unintentionally giving away, like creating the message that like, no, you shouldn't talk about that here. That every, you know, if grace is true, then everything can be said, everything can be trusted.
That'd be a great talk to link for this week, because that's a fantastic talk.
It's a fantastic
couple.
talk.
You won't forget it. It's amazing.
No, you won't forget it.
Which talk is that? Oh, Lee Hickman's talk.
Yeah, I can't remember the title of it.
It's Stranger Things is in the title. I can't remember it either, but
And one last question, if I could.
Yeah.
Is divine justice a combination of law and grace, or ultimately it's up to God, right? But is that a combination of law and grace, or is it, what does it look like? And that's just.
I'm sorry, Miley, did you say is divine justice a combination of law and grace? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, you guys are all quiet, so
Yeah, it makes me nervous.
yeah. So so we mentioned we've used the word righteousness, right? And we talked about Fleming at the beginning of this. And so one of the contributions Fleming has made is by reminding us that the way that the word righteousness functions in Scripture is that it's both, you know, so God imputes something to us that isn't there, but the word also it has a double meaning in that it also means something like rectification, that God is putting things to right. And so I think the mistake Christians often make is in thinking that justice is stuff we have to do to make the world come out right. And that's somehow different than the message of grace. And Fleming's been very good at pointing out that what Paul's talking about in Romans is that the gospel of grace is the way that God is putting, you know, individuals to right, but also the world. Because what you see in the cross is that justice looks like an innocent man dying for ungodly people. And so right off the bat, the way what Christians mean by the word justice is not the same thing that other people who are not Christian mean by the word justice.
I guess I'd add that I think there is in grace a kind of judgment. And I'm thinking of Flannery O'Connor's short story Revelation. And it ends with a vision of grace, but it is a grace that burns away the self-righteousness of her, of Mrs. Turpin, the central character, who's always congratulating herself that she's not like, you know, those people. And so the grace is not, the grace is a refining fire of love. It's not a it contains within itself judgment.
I didn't want to use that word, so I'm glad you used it.
Yeah.
I was afraid to use the word, but
Well,
Yeah.
it's, yeah, okay. We've been kind of schooled with the idea that we should never use that word.
Yeah.
But the problem when we declare some words verboten is that the practice doesn't go away. It just goes underground.
Mhm.
And so to ban the word judgment doesn't make us less judgmental.
Right.
It just makes us kind of proud
Yeah.
of the fact that we don't use the word.
Yeah. And I think the reason that we have reservations in the first place is because, so if you're taking a picture from scripture, right? Moses before the burning bush. How does scripture describe that bush? Moses turns aside to see, and it says, I saw what? A bush that was on fire, but it's not consumed. Right? So judgmentalism in my hands, I tend to not just critique, but I pick apart my enemy and I tear them apart, right? I consume them. Judgment in God's hands exposes what's wayward in me, but makes me clean, right? It
And that's
doesn't
grace.
consume me. It just burns off the things that I don't need, but it leaves the substance of who I am
Mhm.
as something created by God that's good and beautiful and true.
Mhm.
So it doesn't mean I can't ever exercise judgment as a Christian. It just means that I'm more prone to be judgmental and consume somebody, but we're safe in God's hands because God exposes what's wrong, but heals us with that vision too.
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, that's really
Thanks for the
good.
Thanks for the
great
question.
questions.
Yeah, very good.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Because because like Josh, what you're saying, what makes grace a powerful word is that the law is serious. Like, like it's
It's Jean
This-
Valjean and the candlesticks. I mean, he wasn't unaware that he stole the candlesticks
Yeah.
while he was getting grace extended to him. Matter of fact, it probably heightened it all the more, but it made it all the more amazing at the same time. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it's not that God doesn't really care about how you live. It's that God cares so much that, like, he died. So
Which takes us to this week's gospel text and the thief who acknowledges his crime and pleads for grace
Mhm.
and gets it.
Mhm.
well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you, one and
everybody.
all. So I'm sorry.
So next week we will talk about grace
Is it-
in everything. Chapter
Is it
6.
next week, the week he's with us?
Yeah, so Paul Zahl will be
Didn't
with
Paul
us next week.
So get your hair cut, comb your hair, take a shower, iron your shirt,
No grace if we look
like Santa
Strap
Claus
in.
coming to town.
or we're supposed to have pants on too.
Yeah, don't stand up if you're naked. No Jeffrey Tubins.
Come
Wow.
on, man.
Oh, my
Grace.
But
Grace.
I was
Wow.
gone for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I gotta get all my zingers in.
Three.
so-
I think you were gone more than that.
I was raising my children in
So
church.
yeah, so
church administration.
participants, listeners, viewers, Paul Zahl will be with us next week. And then, Tony, this was on the text thread like an hour ago. I don't have your cell phone number.
This is breaking news.
So for Advent, we're going to do a short little series for Advent with Brian Zahn's new Advent book, The Anticipated Christ.
Oh.
And Brian will be with us on November 28th, the first week of Advent.
Okay.
So be there or be square. I'm going to go make dinner now
All right.
and cough a lot.
And cough
Okay.
a lot.